We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us once again is Anatol Lieven. Anatol is the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is somebody I rely on a great deal in terms of his thinking on the situation in Ukraine. He's an area expert there, and he has co-authored a piece that was published recently at quincyinst.org entitled The Diplomatic Path to a Secure Ukraine. And with the president now once again bringing up U.S. military support for Ukraine and that issue likely to resurface in the debate in Congress, I thought this would be a good time to bring him back and talk about it. So first of all, Anatol Lieven, thank you for coming back on the program.
Pleasure.
And let's start with this before we even get into the diplomatic path itself. Why is it? I should say, why do you assume that, if you do, that a military solution is not the answer in Ukraine?
Well, a military solution in terms of the kind of Ukrainian victory that the West has been talking about and the Zelensky government is aiming at, it is simply not possible anymore. If you look at the imbalance in numbers between the Ukrainians and the Russians, if you look at the fact that the Russians have dug in behind miles and miles and miles of minefields, if you look at the fact that the Ukrainian offensive last year failed completely, and if you look at the fact that at the moment, but also for a very long time to come, Russia is outmatching us in terms of basic military production. The idea of Ukraine achieving, what Zelensky has said is its goal, or the Ukrainian government has said is its goal, and the West has in principle committed itself to, which is the complete withdrawal of Russia from all the territories that it has occupied since 2014. I mean, that simply cannot happen. The Russian government has also not collapsed. The Russian economy has not collapsed. In fact, it's doing considerably better than those of Western Europe. So we're not going to get a military victory. On the contrary, we are now, as the latest news from the front line in Ukraine very strongly suggests, looking at the real possibility of much bigger Ukrainian defeat. And the Biden administration has given very contradictory signals about a compromise peace. It's never come straight out and advocated that. But on the other hand, several officials have said that the aim is to strengthen Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table, which implies there will be negotiations. The problem is that all the evidence suggests that Ukraine's position at the negotiating table, should it come, is getting not stronger but weaker over time. It could get catastrophically weaker. There have been, many reports, most recently on the BBC, that there is a real risk of a Russian breakthrough and Russia taking much more territory. That, I think, also lies behind President Macron of France's suggestion that NATO troops might actually be sent to defend Ukraine, because if Russia does break through, that weapon supplies will not come quickly enough to stop Russia. But of course, if we send our own troops to Ukraine, then we are at war with Russia, which is something. Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because it seems to me that there is a stark choice that's not being faced when we talk about strengthening Ukraine's position at the negotiating table, which is something, I've heard from various sources too, there's still talk of victory. Zelensky talks of victory and so on, but really that's the goal. Uh, Aside from the fact that there's an ongoing risk of, as you say, catastrophically weakening Ukraine's position at the negotiating table, I think what gets passed over a little bit, elided a little bit in that sort of conversation is, well, precisely how would we do that given the circumstances on the ground? Macron, as you say, talks about sending in troops. There's talk about providing. The United States early in the war, the Biden administration laid down what are called red lines in terms of certain types of weapons it would not provide because of fears of escalation with Russia, between Russia and the United States. It has provided some of those weapons. Now there's talk about longer range missiles and so on. It seems to me that the risk there is, but correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that the risk there is one of dramatic escalation. And in fact, now we're hearing that scenarios were played out at one point for possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. What would NATO and the U.S. do if Russia deployed battlefield nuclear weapons? Seems less likely, I suppose, now that it's winning the conventional war. But should we escalate, that remains a risk. So I guess long story short, my question would be, is there a real, I know I'm asking you to assess in essence, the unknowable, but is there a real risk that the West might escalate to the point of risking a direct confrontation? And if so, why would that be unwise?
Well, when Macron made this suggestion, all the other governments, including Britain, which has been strongest supporters of Ukraine, Germany immediately, and America, by the way, they all came out and said, no, this is not going to happen. And that is because they do understand the risks, but also because they are responding to public opinion. Macron's statement was odd in many ways because, according to opinion polls, the French population is against any such intervention by well over 3-1. There's not a popular position in the West. Because, of course, if we do that, we will be at war with Russia. People use euphemisms like, direct confrontation with Russia. No. If Western troops go into action, or Western aircraft go into action against the Russian armed forces, we are at war with a nuclear superpower. And while, as you say, Russia will not use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, it now has no reason to do so. If we are at war with Russia and Russia starts to lose in consequence, well, that is the scenario for nuclear war. That is the scenario by which we always thought we would use nuclear weapons, if our ground forces were being defeated. So the risk is very high. But what the Biden administration is now hoping to do is basically to prop up the Ukrainians to stand on the defensive after the US presidential elections. I mean, in fact, everybody is waiting for that. There's a very general feeling in China, in Moscow too, that there will be no initiative from America until after the elections, because after the elections, either Biden will be freer, actually to take some initiative, or of course Trump will win, and then it won't be Biden's problem, and Trump can be, blamed and cursed for surrender to Russia. But my fear is that Ukraine may not hold out that long. Well, that's the first one. But the second is that now all the talk, pressure on Germany to provide long-range cruise missiles. Well, the Germans have said, everyone said these weapons must not be used again, to actually strike targets within Russia or Moscow. But of course we can't. The Ukrainians, by the way, have made that promise before and have repeatedly broken it. I mean, if they have those weapons, and Western military analysts with official links have been talking openly about no, Ukraine's strategy must now be to hit Russia, to hit the population of Russia and the economy of Russia. Well, people in the West don't fully realize that Putin is by no means the hardliner in Russia. Right. That he has been extensively criticized in public for not acting toughly enough against the West for doing all this. If the Ukrainians were to either cause mass civilian casualties, which of course, they have a perfect right to do, given how they have been attacked. But if they do, or if they hit a really high-profile target in Russia, then of course, Putin would be under tremendous pressure to escalate in turn. And given that, it is now open knowledge that we have been providing the Ukrainians not just with the weapons, but with the training, with the direction, with intelligence, targeting of those weapons, we're getting awfully close to the brink there.
Well, and, I find myself here in Washington of being in the curious position of seemingly one of the few journalists, certainly, and perhaps one of the few people who have actually read the bill that includes $50 billion in additional military aid for Ukraine, as well as some other forms of aid and other forms of military aid around the world and so on. But it includes, for example, some $25 million for United States Air Force, Marine, and Space Force personnel to directly support Ukrainian efforts, which suggests that there's already some level of U.S. involvement. And clearly there is in terms of training, as you say, support, as well as weaponry. So we run a risk there. And I also just wanted to highlight, given the pushback that one often gets talking about this subject, what you said about Ukraine having a right to do certain things, given that they've been attacked. Under international law, as I understand it, if you're attacked, invaded, you do have a right to, of course, to counterattack, even if that involves civilian casualties. There are other things Ukraine has done that, frankly, for example, I'm thinking of the sabotage of a Russian train tunnel, or even the assassinations, which are illegal. The Alexandra Dugin, the daughter of the Russian pro-war advocate, and so on. I mean, if I put myself in the shoes of a Ukrainian, I might very understandably want to do that too. But
absolutely, yeah.
But there are multiple forces at play here. I mean, to me, one of the failures of understanding in the whole U.S. debate and the Western European debate about the war is that this is not a two-party conflict, it's a multi-party conflict. And I was wondering your thoughts about that this is not just Ukraine versus Russia, and therefore we must side with Ukraine. It's Ukraine plus NATO plus Russia, with a history behind that. And just as Ukraine is entitled to act in its own interests, we can and must as well. And to me, it seems that whether the current leadership of Ukraine agrees or not, it is neither in Ukraine's interest nor the West's to prolong a war that is not going to succeed. Of all people, I think the Ukrainians pay the most in loss of life, infrastructure, and so on. But am I mistaken about that?
No, I mean, absolutely. And I think, our governments need to remember that, of course, we sympathize with the Ukrainians, but the Biden administration, President Biden, has been elected by the American people, not the Ukrainian people. Right. It's his duty ultimately to keep them safe. British government similarly, and also, of course, well, what is morally or legally permitted, is not necessarily the same as what is wise or sensible. Right. And there, I think, part of the problem is this difficulty or even impossibility that I think so many Americans have, but Europeans too now, which is, just hang on, stop and think about it a bit. America gets into a proxy war outside America. And, I mean, I know the moral parallels are not the same, but, America has not, shall we say, always acted with accordance with international law, morality, and its international behavior. And in consequence, you have a situation in which the country with which America is fighting starts firing missiles into America,
Right.
into South Carolina, into Florida, into Alabama, perhaps in future into Washington. And these missiles are being directed by Russian intelligence officers with the help of Russian satellites. How long would America tolerate that? How long would America wait before reacting directly against Russia? My suggestion would be about 5 minutes.
Right. No, absolutely. And that gets us to your piece, Anatol, with George Beebe. Is it pronounced Beebe?
Beebe.
Beebe. With George Beebe, the diplomatic path to a secure Ukraine. And before we get into it, I guess I would say, I'll just point out that, for example, in Politico Europe, the European version of Politico, there was an article quoting an unnamed EU official and an unnamed senior U.S. Biden administration official, and the American official basically said, "We're going to have a negotiated settlement to this thing, but we can't do it before the election," which raises all sorts of disturbing questions. But whether now or whether later, and I would argue that now is much safer than later, I think there's beginning to be a widespread assumption that this will have to end diplomatically. There's no scenario, as we've just discussed, where Ukraine prevails over a country that's so much larger, that's so much more powerful economically in terms of manpower. There's a manpower crisis in Ukraine. They're, basically dragooning people off the street at this point, causing a political problem in Ukraine and so on. So that all leads us to the notion of a diplomatic path. It would be a bitter pill to swallow, I imagine. Um, People may regret not taking some of the deals that were on the table that people like Boris Johnson from the UK had discouraged and so on. But I assume there's no choice at this point. Unless you disagree with that, I guess we should talk about uh, the value, what the nature of such a agreement might look like. Would that be an appropriate pivot for us to make at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that George and I have tried to point out is that while a compromise peace would be indeed very painful for the Ukrainians and generally regarded in Ukraine and in the West as a Ukrainian defeat, in fact, given what Putin was aiming at when he invaded Ukraine, which was basically the subjugation of the whole country, turning Ukraine back into a client state, but also in terms of the history of the past 350 years of Russian domination of Ukraine, if we could get a settlement in which 80% of Ukraine was independent, neutral, but very anti-Russian. I traveled in Ukraine last year, and obviously, and now, I mean, including the Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine generally are bitterly anti-Russian, obviously, and with a path to join the European Union, if it can. In this wider context, this is not a Ukrainian defeat. This would be a very historic Ukrainian victory, not a complete victory, but as we've said, and as you said, everybody now recognizes complete victory is just not possible. So what are the terms? Well, I think the thing is that you have to begin. Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria, often quoted, politics is the art of the possible. Right. You have to begin with reality. Well, the first reality, Ukraine is not going to recover its lost territory. And it could lose much more territory the longer we wait. It will not get back to the negotiating table what it has not recovered on the battlefield. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is, on the other hand, Ukraine cannot possibly give up these territories legally, nor can we possibly force the Ukrainians to do so. So the only solution there is what Zelensky himself actually proposed early in the war, and what we have followed in Cyprus, before that in Kashmir and elsewhere, which is you just have to defer this issue for negotiation. You freeze the existing situation. You don't recognize it legally or morally, but you say this will be, negotiated, and you hope that in some future completely new world configuration, perhaps that some compromise may be possible. So that's the first thing. The second thing, reality. We have said again and again, response to Macron, shows it to Macron's suggestion of troops for Ukraine. We will not go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. We will not send our own troops to fight Russia for the sake of Ukraine. Well, at that point, the suggestion of NATO membership is completely empty. If you're not going to fight for a country, you cannot make it your ally. It's ridiculous. It's so neutrality. Also, but Zelensky said just this early in the war. He said, look, I went to all the NATO capitals before the war and I asked them, NATO governments, can you guarantee that within 5 years, Ukraine will be a member of NATO? And they all said, no, we can't guarantee that. And at that point, Zelensky said publicly, why not a treaty of neutrality? With, of course, many the strongest guarantees we can put in place for Ukraine. So those two key issues, realistically seen, are off the table. We've conceded them already. Beyond that, there are, however, things that would have to be negotiated. Here, the Austrian State Treaty of 1954 is an interest by which the NATO and the Soviet Union, or the Warsaw Pact, withdrew from Austria. And by the way, Austria became a successful Western democracy. I traveled in Austria, I traveled in Finland during the last years of the Cold War. They weren't members of NATO, they weren't members of the European Union either, for that matter. But nobody doubted for a single second that they were Western democracy, free market democracies. Finland kept, coming first in the world for the happiness of its population. So, there's nothing wrong with neutrality in principle. But there were two things
made
there.
Very good phones. I'm sorry to interrupt, but they had very good technology too. I mean, they were leaders in certain fields. They were, I'm speaking of Finland, where I traveled around the same time. And certainly Austria was, you wouldn't know, you weren't in a quote unquote NATO country. There was no question about it. It's an excellent point. Sorry to interrupt.
No, sure. But I do emphasize that again and again. Now, the difficult ones, which did come into the Austrian State Treaty, are Russia's demands for demilitarization. But there, we have to explore what Russia means by that. And of course, when it comes to NATO, any NATO agreements to pull back troops have to be matched by Russia. It has to be reciprocal, obviously. As far as Ukraine is concerned, under the Austrian State Treaty, certain categories of arms were banned for Austria. So if the Russians are prepared to negotiate this, we could indeed talk about things like long-range missiles. Obviously, no NATO bases in Austria. Now, denazification is something else that is not at all clear. Under the Austrian State Treaty, Austria, like Germany, by the way, had to pass laws banning neo-Nazi parties and banning Nazi symbolism in public. Now, if Russia is prepared to accept that, well, I mean, damn it, if Ukraine is on its way to join the European Union, it should do that anyway. Right. Problem is, of course, that there are very heavily armed fascistic groups in Ukraine. So the question is, would Russia accept this kind of legal commitment, or is Putin aiming at actually changing the Ukrainian government, getting rid of Zelensky? That, of course, is non-negotiable. But the point is, we can only find out what Russia's positions are on these key issues by asking them, by negotiating with them. so much of the so-called Western debate involves Western journalists and commentators saying Putin will never agree to this,
Right.
or Putin will never agree to that, or Putin is aiming at attacking NATO, which is absolutely ridiculous, by the way. This is Putin's thinking. How the hell do they know?
Right.
The only way we find out Putin's thinking is by asking him, by negotiating with him.
Well, that's an excellent point, and it's one that's troubled me in the sense that uh, you don't have to embrace somebody or like somebody to negotiate with them. In fact, the point of this kind of diplomacy is you're talking to someone you're in opposition to. That's what the diplomacy is for. And it strikes me, I love your thoughts on this, Anatol. It strikes me in a sense that a Western political culture has devolved when it comes to diplomacy. It used to be that at a minimum, Democrats or social democrats in Europe uh, were the parties of negotiation. That, for example, the Democratic Party here in the U.S. Uh, loved to retell almost as folklore the way that John F. Kennedy defused the Cuban Missile Crisis and potentially prevented a nuclear war. But what he did, as we well know, is Soviet Union was placing missiles very close to us, something akin to the threat that Russia might feel today. And that escalated, and in return, Kennedy agreed to pull missiles out of Turkey. So it seems to me that while that was greatly admired for decades afterward, and in my view, rightfully so, uh, we're in a situation now where the equivalence is treated as if it's unthinkable, even though the Soviet Union was a far larger confederation of countries and so on. Russia's economy is a fraction of ours and so on. I think it's the equivalent of what, Spain's or Italy's or something. That it seems to me that we've gone backward in the West in terms of respect for diplomacy as a tool of state. Am I wrong about that?
Yes, I mean the so-called unipolar moment, when America could, to a degree, or thought it could, do whatever it liked in the world, was extraordinarily short. It lasted barely 15 years until, Iraq went badly wrong. And yet the mindset created then has sort of become almost the standard operating procedure. And one aspect of that is this belief that you are making a concession just by talking to people.
Right.
But before you start talking about mutual concessions and compromises, just by talking to them, you are giving something away. Well, that is the absolute antithesis of diplomacy, and is a bar to diplomacy. But I think you mentioned the left in Europe. I think a key problem there is with the end of communism, which, even though they may have denied it as a dream, did lurk in the background of the left-wing parties. This has been replaced by what Samuel Moyn calls the religion of human rights, supported, of course, by now, I mean, a very large infrastructure of human rights organizations in the West, which employ a lot of, prominent people and a lot of, educated people, and of course are dedicated to principles of absolute morality, which you do not find in international affairs. And if you look at people like the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, she is basically an NGO worker in politics. Of course, the crazy thing is that this then leads to what is essentially a neoconservative position, which is you have to use military force, either your own or other people's, in order to promote, these absolute values in politics. Now, the other thing I think is, we are both, alas, the older generation, but it just struck me so much traveling in Germany, and to a lesser extent in France as well and elsewhere in Europe, that in the past, people were well aware that war itself, in itself, is an offense against humanity and human rights. Nobody who went through the Second World War, or even was brought up by people who had fought or gone through the Second World War, could have that confidence that going to war, unless you have to, of course, because you yourself have been attacked or you are facing something like Nazism, but that going to war is likely actually to contribute to advancing human rights and good things in the world. But of course, that generation is dead. The generation in France that was pretty skeptical about French commitments to human rights in the world, and after either participating in or witnessing the wars in Indochina and Algeria, all of these people are now dead or very, very old, and the generation of the Baerbocks just has no idea of this, basically. And of course, they've never served themselves, even in peacetime. They've never worn a uniform.
Right. And I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback, but I think that's critical in the sense that, for example, our father's generation, roughly speaking, those who served in the military, and I say fathers because it was primarily men in those days, didn't have the my pronunciation is the fetishization of military leaders that we see now among the NGO crowd, let's say. I mean, this fantasy of the good war for all things good and positive. People of my father's generation who served in World War II would always talk about those dumb bastards, meaning the generals or what have you, because they understood that now we have a political culture that venerates generals, even in contexts where we should be turning to the diplomats. And I guess in conclusion, I think for me, one of the great values of your work, and I encourage people to read this particular piece, is that we really need to be thinking in terms of diplomacy, and that, if we want to be tough and clear-eyed and all those qualities that we like to associate with the military, we should also be realistic about what the generals are telling us in this case as well. What Zelensky's own general told him about a stalemate. His response was to replace him. What some of the U.S. generals are saying about a stalemate, that this is at best as good as we can get, is my understanding, on the battlefield, and that, as you say, it could get catastrophically worse. So we should be doing the kind of thinking you and George Beebe are doing, rather than, and I'm baffled by Biden's request for $50 billion in military aid, which is, according to what the State Department tells us, as much as we've spent in 2 years to support Ukraine. So either there's hidden expense they're trying to pay back, or they're planning escalation, or they're planning 2 more years of war. That seems to me, whatever it is, to be misguided. And with that, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Well, just that I think the time to negotiate is now, and we will have because I hope that Ukraine can hold out until after the next elections, and that then we will be ready for compromise. But I really don't think that we can be at all sure of that anymore. And there is this risk that we could find ourselves in a situation where either we will have to make much bigger concessions to Russia, or we will have to escalate in a way which could be catastrophic for us, for the world, for Russia, but also for Ukraine. I mean, people always talk about backing Ukraine for as long as it takes. They aren't the people doing the dying.
Right. And the World Bank, I believe, estimated some months ago that it would take nearly $500 billion as it is to rebuild Ukraine, with more damage.
That was a year ago.
Oh, a year ago. Okay, I knew it was months ago.
It'll be a lot more today.
Right. So underscoring the importance of your work, I would say again, I encourage people to read the paper, the Quincy paper number 13, The Diplomatic Path to a Secure Ukraine. It's co-author, my guest, Anatol Lieven. As always, Anatol, thank you so much for your excellent work, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Hi, this is Richard RJ Eskow for the Zero Hour. We urgently need your help here at the Zero Hour to keep the program going, so we would appreciate anything you could do. If you're able to contribute, please go to patreon.com/the Zero Hour or become a paid subscriber of our newsletter at Eskow, ESKOW.substack.com. If you can help, we would very much appreciate it.